I'm going to call this basically we have three very distinguished diplomats, who I would say, though, the good news is they're three of the most direct, maybe I'd say undiplomatic diplomats I know, and a national debate champion to hopefully keep things very spicy. So we have Toya Newland, the CEO of CNAS, who previously was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, State Department spokesperson, and also our former ambassador to NATO. Colin Kahl, who is a senior fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, and previously served as a National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, and also as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Barbara Leaf, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who is a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, newly minted, just a couple of months, coming off of her last tour after a long career in the Foreign Service, where she was our U.S. ambassador in the United Arab Emirates, and Ambassador Eric Edelman, who is the counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Eric previously was an Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Turkey, I apologize, and National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney.
We just look alike. We're not
actually
this American.
Well, we have lots of people who've worked for vice presidents too here.
Exactly.
So. But Toria, I think I'd like to start with you. You and I just got back from the region a month ago, and this Russian dynamic is something that's just very different than what we've seen in the past in the Middle East. You just didn't used to hear about them. What do you think the Russians are trying to do in the Middle East? Why are they getting engaged, and do you think they're being effective at it?
I think they've been enormously effective, if only through the anecdotal evidence that we had on our trip, Ilan, which was that everywhere we went, countries were more interested in what Russia was going to do, whether Russia was going to protect them, whether they could cut a deal with Russia, whether the deal they cut would hold or would fall apart, than they were in petitioning the United States or thinking that the U.S. administration would get back to its traditional role of refereeing issues and managing the balance of forces. You know, on the what does the Kremlin want, what does Putin want, I think you have to start by taking President Putin at his word in most cases. From 2005 on, he said that the greatest tragedy that ever happened to the Russian people was the falling apart of the Soviet Union. So at a macro level, he wants to get back to the kind of influence and balancing power that Russia had or the Soviet Union had in the Middle East. At the tactical level, it's a matter of bases and force projection. But more viscerally, I think it's about his great fear of regime change. He was not happy with the way our arrangements in Libya went when Russia, under Medvedev as president at that time, allowed the UN Security Council resolution that led the way to bombing and Gaddafi's downfall. He sensed lack of resolve in the way the U.S. was handling Syria, I think, and saw an opening, and also was concerned that if Assad went, then the protector of their basing rights and their equities would go. But as with everything with the Russians, I think the appetite has grown with the eating. So now, in part, because the U.S. has been unclear about its objectives and about how much it's willing to play its usual role, the Russians have seen new opportunities. So now they are the balancer, at least in Syria. They are the country that Israel goes to get control over Iran. They're the country that Jordan goes to when they worry if there's going to be a new southern front that's going to send refugees across the border. So Moscow's doing quite well, with the sole exception of the fact that they're learning once again, as they did in Afghanistan, that these things are extremely expensive at a time when the Russian Federation is not as rich as it used to be, and particularly as you get into the third year, where your equipment starts to break down, where you have to use new forces. You might have noticed that Putin raised the pension age this week and increased the VAT tax. Well, that's because these adventures he's on are expensive.
You think they can keep it up?
I think it all depends on us, and it all depends on how we play. I think we have an opportunity. if we use the relationships we've historically had and we use the 2,200 troops, which is so small in the historic context that we have in Syria, and if we use the progress that we've made in Iraq to reassert our historic role of ensuring that the end states in Iraq, in Syria, ideally in Yemen and in Libya, favor openness, favor more participation by citizens, favor stability, and block out Iranian influence. Otherwise, I think Russia will become the arbiter, and Iran will be a tool that Russia turns on and turns off to maintain influence.
Well, that's a good transition, talking about Iran. So, Colin, to speak to you, one of the other boogeymen in the region, being the Iranians and sort of their behavior. And I'd be interested to get your perspective. Let's make this conversation a little bit different and not spend all of our time on the JCPOA, which is what everybody seems to do when we start talking about Iran. But let's start with talking mostly about what is Iran doing in the region.
Well, Iran is extraordinarily active in the region. I think if you want to understand Iran's objectives, I think across the elite spectrum of Iranian officials, they see themselves as the natural hegemonic actor in the region, much as the Russians see themselves as the most powerful actor in Eurasia, and the Chinese see themselves as the most powerful actor in East Asia. The Iranians have a similar view, and this predates, by the way, the Islamic Republic. This was something that the Shah's Iran also envisioned, and it was something actually the U.S. foreign policy leveraged by making the Shah's Iran a cornerstone of our foreign policy prior to the revolution. So that hasn't changed. They continue to want to be the dominant actor in the region. But I do think that the elite consensus breaks down after that. That you do tend to have pragmatists, centrists, moderates, if you're comfortable with those terms, who believe that the natural gravitational weight of Iran, its geographic position as a pivot between Europe and Asia and the Middle East, its large population, 70 million people, more than twice the size of Saudi Arabia, and the kind of dynamism and creativity and civilizational verve of the Iranian people make Iran a naturally dominant actor so long as Iran is normalized and integrated into the international community, right? So they seek dominance, but largely through engagement with the rest of the international community, whereas I think hardliners and principalists inside Iran believe that the way towards dominating the region is through serving as a vanguard for revolution and by promoting resistance. And that divide has held since the revolution. It continues to hold sway today, and we could have a conversation or a debate about which side is up or down as a consequence of some of the actions that have been taken in the last couple of years. But I think if you look at Iran's actions across the region, obviously they're active in Yemen. You mentioned the Houthis in the introduction. They're supportive of a lot of different actors inside of Iraq. They're propping up Assad. They're supportive of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They continue to have ties to Palestinian groups in Gaza. But I think a lot of times people treat all of these things as the same, and they're not the same, right? So in Yemen, for example, Iran doesn't have interest in dominating Yemen. I think what they see is an opportunity to bleed the Saudis at very low cost. They can make the Saudis spend billions of dollars by providing tens of millions of dollars of assistance to the Houthis, and that's a totally smart and rational foreign policy from their perspective. In Iraq and to some degree in Afghanistan, their goals are to have relatively weak but stable states over which they have a degree of political influence to at least be able to veto things they don't like, to create buffers against their enemies. Whereas in places like Syria and Lebanon, the goal of projecting power is first and foremost to be able to exert leverage over Israel, but also to hold Israel's population and infrastructure and its economy at risk as a deterrent, so that Israel doesn't attack Iran. And I think that it's this mix of offensive and defensive motivations that sometimes gets confused when people kind of treat Iran as their foreign policy as kind of singularly expansionist. I think it's actually probably more complicated than that.
So, Colin, just following up on that, what do you make of this increasing Iranian-Israeli tensions and potential conflict in Syria that we've been seeing sort of play out over the past few months, and where do you think that goes?
I think it's going to get worse. And I think actually if there's a single flashpoint for an interstate war in the Middle East, it's in Syria, and especially along the Israel-Iran dyad. I will say just that you didn't ask a question about the Trump administration. I won't talk too much about their policy, but if you ask me in a nutshell what I think their policy is in the region, I would call it offshore hegemony. In the sense that they want to be the dominant actor in the region while not having very much military skin in the game. And here I'm mostly talking about the president. And they want to exert a lot of pressure on Iran, principally through the economic toolkit, which is, I think, how you can understand the exit from the JCPOA, the Iran deal. But militarily, essentially, their policy is to delegate. It's to tell the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, go get them, guys. And actually, as you mentioned, Trump has signaled that he doesn't want a long-term investment in Syria. He doesn't want to invest in competition militarily with Iran in Syria. I think he's ambivalent about our presence in Iraq. And so the Israelis, I think, or at least the Netanyahu government, is happy with the Iran nuclear decision. I think they're somewhat disappointed with the amount of support they are getting in Syria. And as a result, they're taking action on their own. And principally, the targets that they've hit are to go after two types of assets that the Iranians have put into Syria. One is the transit of strategic weapon systems through Syria on the way either to the Golan frontier or into Lebanon to arm Hezbollah. So they hit convoys. They've done over 100 strikes. In fact, they just did a strike, at least according to the press, a couple of days ago in Abu Kamal, which was by far the most east they've ever gone in Syria. And my guess is they were hitting something they thought was transiting the Iraq border across that land bridge that they oftentimes talk about to remind the Iranians they can hurt them. But the other goal, I think, is to not have the Iranians establish a beachhead or a significant amount of infrastructure to indigenously produce rockets and precision munitions inside of Syria, because the Israelis properly are worried that the next northern war will be a two-front war that could be quite costly for the Israelis, because they'll have to fight across southern Lebanon and the Golan frontier at the same time at great expense. And so I think that you're likely to see a tit-for-tat cycle. I don't think the Israelis want a big war, not right now. I don't think the Iranians want one either. I don't think the Russians want one either, because it puts Assad at some risk if it happens. But history is littered with examples of wars that nobody wanted that happened anyway when people start killing people.
Well, that's a cheerful thought, as always, in the Middle East. Now let's.
Are there any archdukes?
Let's move on now to another one of our partners, in really the Gulf states. Obviously, Barbara, you just spent a number of years out in the Gulf, where the biggest story might seem to be Mohammed bin Salman and the new, not so new anymore, but Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the policies he has taken, which seem to be both socially moving the country forward in some ways, but also foreign policy, a much more aggressive approach. I mean, what do you make of sort of how the Saudis and the Emiratis are viewing us and are viewing the region as a whole and the competition that's ongoing?
Well, I was thinking about just that thing, that issue when Toria and Colin were talking about this contest that is ongoing, and I subscribe to that view, but I think I take it a bit further. I look at Syria as ground zero for a sort of would-be great power competition. Eric will talk to the Turkish dimension of that. And we are largely absent. And in fact, I think the administration has struggled to really concoct a general strategy towards Syria and beyond. And on the margins of this, you have two of our most significant partners, Saudi Arabia and UAE, I think ranged along with the Israelis looking at all of this with some concern. Now, to the issue of what MBS is up to, he is undertaking as the would-be inheritor of the throne and somebody who could be around for decades. He's undertaking two big transformations. One of them obviously is the internal dimension, and it is huge, and it is seismic, and it has repercussions not only for Saudi Arabia's stability, but for the wider region. And as many people have commented here and in the region, and if he hadn't come along, we would be wishing that such a creature of change, a change agent, would have come along, because otherwise we would have what has been the historical norm, which is shall we say, a stately process of governance and succession, which is generally elderly and is generally very, very status quo. So here you have a change agent who is really more than rattling the teacups internally. He's taking on various elements, including his own family, consolidating power rather ruthlessly, but at least the theory goes that given the task that he has ahead of him, given the likely quarters of resistance that he will get within the family, within the religious establishment, and I say that very loosely, and then with very conservative sectors of society, including among the young, which are ostensibly his main audience, resistance to what is a breathtaking opening up of a very, very closed society, the kingdom. Side by side with that, he's made some big, abrupt, often, moves on the foreign policy front. Yemen is commonly considered his war, even if he was only defense minister and deputy crown prince at the time, but it's considered his war. We had the trifecta of events last November. The appearance of Houthi Iranian-supplied missiles over Riyadh, the sweeping arrests of businessmen and some members of the family on corruption charges and a lengthy detention, and then that very curious episode with Saad Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon. And then we get to how he looks at Iran and how he looks at Syria, and the very, very curious evolving relationship with Russia that we see among our Gulf partners. I would, just to finish up, say that this issue of how Russia comes into the region is very much, of course, in Putin's eyes, a zero-sum contest. I think it's also, he's very strategically aligned with Tehran in the sense of wanting to push and marginalize U.S. influence. And frankly, they are being helped in this project right now by this sort of inchoate nature of the administration's approach on very fundamental questions about Syria and Iraq. I'll stop there.
So Barbara, just one additional question for you. Do you think that this whole transformation that MBS is undertaking, is it going to work? Or is it just as likely that this fails and he's in a succession battle, he's ejected? Or do you think that Saudi Arabia is on an inevitable course now? Sort of?
There's nothing inevitable in the Middle East. I think we've learned that through all of our adult careers. There's nothing inevitable about his success. He is only at the front end of this transformation. He's doing some big symbolic, but also operationally important moves like the decision to permit women to drive. That will allow them to get into the marketplace of jobs. And on the other hand, in tandem to that, actually leading up to that move, he had arrested 2 generations of women activists who had been part of that Let's Let Women Drive movement. So that's a very muddled message. He's done some other sort of big, easy things on opening up and providing entertainment opportunities, which haven't been there for 30 years. But then he did something really tough, but did it, which was to fully curtail the remit of the religious police, and that was hugely popular.
Well, let's pivot on to one of our other, traditional partners, Turkey, but increasingly the question is, are they a partner? As still a NATO ally. But Eric, what do you make of Turkish behavior in the region and how they've been part of this sort of fueling of instability over the past few years?
Well, Turkey's been a very difficult partner for the U.S. for a very long time, I would say going back to, say, 1947. The partnership's been better and worse over those years, but frankly, we shouldn't romanticize this relationship, and I think there's a big tendency to look back at it through the rose-colored glasses of where the relationship was in the late 90s under the Clinton administration when President Clinton went to Turkey and declared a strategic partnership. That was really, I would say, probably more the exception than the rule in the relationship. I mean, going back to 1947, Dean Acheson, in closed testimony in behalf of the Truman Doctrine, said that Greece and Turkey were imperfect democracies. Turkey was an imperfect democracy. It remains a very imperfect democracy. The real issue, I think, right now with regard to Turkey is, what direction it takes after this next election. A lot of, I think, the trouble in our relationship has been driven by domestic political developments in Turkey. And I think, it's easier, I think, to say kind of what we should stop doing than it is to say what we should do. And when it comes to what we ought to stop doing, I think the last 3 administrations, and this is in the spirit of what Toria and I in an earlier part of our careers would have called criticism, self-criticism, The Bush, Obama, and now Trump administrations have all, I think, operated on the basis of a relatively simple proposition, which is whatever the ups and downs, whatever the irritants in the relationship, if we continue to treat Turkey like an ally, ultimately, eventually, they will behave like an ally. And I think at some point you have to, it is Einstein's definition of insanity being the process of repeating everything that you've been doing without getting a different result. So I think we really have to have a different kind of approach, a little harder to say what it is. Where I think we are with Turkey, it's the great cliche at all of these panel discussions to say whatever the topic, we're at a real inflection point.
Next 6 months are critical.
And unless we have a strategy, we're not going to be able to deal with it.
It's a watershed moment.
We could go on.
And we have.
But I think in the case of Turkey, we really are at an inflection point because the election on Sunday, after which the new constitutional provisions of the executive presidency kick in, I think are going to have a lot to say about whether Turkey moves from the category of, troubled or imperfect democracy to, more or less a full-blown autocracy. And that, I think, will change the nature of that relationship for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that the United States Congress, I think, will have some things to say about that could be very, very difficult for not only this administration, for any administration to manage, particularly for this administration.
Eric, can I dive in a little deeper on one question on the Turks, which is the tensions we've had with them over the Kurdish issue in the past few years, especially since we've essentially used a Kurdish fighting force to defeat ISIS. And is there a way to repair that particular rift with Turkey?
Well, we'll see, because there's an effort to do just that right now with regard to the evacuation of Manbij by YPG forces and the approach of Turkish forces. I've seen there's already been some tension as Turkish forces have approached the city, and we'll see whether the efforts that Secretary Tillerson began and that Secretary Pompeo continued will actually lead to a decrease in tensions. Quite honestly, although I'm pretty hard on Turkey in my comments in general in public, I do have some sympathy for their position. They do have a legitimate security interest in what happens in northeastern Syria. They also have a very real problem with the PKK. It's been a very serious insurgency that's faced the country for almost 40 years and cost almost 40,000 lives. So it's a very serious security issue, which I think we have not in all cases taken with the appropriate seriousness that we should have given it. I think we've paid a lot of lip service to it occasionally, which has been an understandable irritant to the Turks. And it's something that ultimately we have to address. Although I would say that the direction we ought to be pushing them in is to understand that in the end of the day, what happens in Rojava for Turkey is less important than what happens in Turkey.
Yeah.
And that the most constructive thing that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has done since his arrival in power in 2002 was to begin a negotiation process with the Kurds, and that's what they need to get back to. And I think there we could legitimately have something to offer because of our ties. We can, I think, make a legitimate offer to give good offices, try and help make this a successful outcome for Turkey, and also make the point to them that would they rather be dealing with armed Kurdish militias without our presence in Syria, or would they like to have our influence at play? And I think that's something we could use if we were able to do it intelligently to affect the situation in a positive way.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question really to all of you, and then I think after that we'll open it up to questions from the audience, which is that we've spent a lot of time talking about the various powers in the region, and we started to talk about the one that we probably are most concerned with, which is the United States. And what is it that we should be doing in this situation? What is it that we are doing or that we're doing right and wrong right now? And be really interested to hear from all of you how you would like to, what else should we be doing in the Middle East, or what we're doing right or wrong right now. Nothing. That's a big question. It gives you an opportunity to...
I'll take a shot. Look, I think one thing that, at least from my vantage point, that we should be at the forefront of our minds is that we should be humble about our ability to achieve and transform this part of the world. I think in the past 3 administrations, you've kind of seen a policy that's done everything in its opposite, none of which has worked out well at low cost in kind of transforming a region that I think is very impervious to that. It doesn't mean we don't have very real interests in the region. We do. We have profound interests. We need strategies that are tailored around those interests, and I think you can find fault with all 3 of the past administrations on that score. I think my biggest critique of what we're doing now is that, well, first of all, I would argue that in those places where you've had the most success, you've had the most continuity. That is, the counter-ISIS campaign is essentially just the culmination of the campaign put in by the previous administration. For better or worse, it's the most successful element of the current administration's policy and the highest degree of continuity. The highest degree of discontinuity, of course, is essentially the blank check or green light or the all-in with our traditional allies, which I think has not restrained them or improved their behavior, and in some ways has emboldened them to do things that I don't think advance our interest, much like the perception of American retreat in the previous administration also generated anxieties, Alon, that you talked about. I think my biggest critique of the current administration is that they built leverage to nowhere. Right? So they built up all this capital with MBS and Mohammed bin Zayed, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but don't appear to have any plan to cash it in on a peace plan in Yemen. Right? They built up all this credibility with Israel. They wanted a fresh start with Russia. We have the fact that we own 1/3 of Syria, and yet we don't appear to be willing to use any of that leverage to drive towards an outcome in Syria that ends the war and most especially prevents the civil war from becoming an interstate war. So it is a cliche at things like this to say there isn't a strategy. But we have, through some mix of conscious efforts and kind of a madman routine, generated some leverage in this part of the world. And yet it's not clear to me at all that we have a coherent idea about how to cash it in a way that will actually make us safer.
So I would just, the point I would differ with Colin on is the idea of a blank check. I don't think we've actually given a blank check. I think actually we've simply walked away, we've taken our hands off the steering wheel, we walked away from the car. So, you have Yemen, you have Libya, you have, burning embers of Syria, you have Iraq now settling into something post-ISIS, but without the kind of really high-level engagement from Washington, visible high-level engagement from Washington that all of these crises require. So the Saudis and the Emiratis are doing what they can with this latest phase of Yemen, but they require us to be fully engaged in a political sense, and we're not, absolutely not engaged in Libya. And on Syria, it's very clear that the president has a certain perspective that is narrowly focused on troops. Syria can't just be about troops, but if it is, we've got to look at it through the prism of how does Syria's future trajectory have blowback or not on Iraq? And we have spent 15 plus years of blood and treasure in getting that country to a place where it could actually get onto a stable path and to lift off. And it is a contest point, but it's a political contest point with Iran. I would like to see the meat on the bones for the Iran strategy, such as it is. And it starts with Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, if I could, I agree with much of what Colin and Barbara have said. There's a lot of frustration, I think, that one feels among government officials, members of the Congress, and the public at large about this region. And people are tired of it. In general, I think their attitude reflects what I once heard a lecturer say, which was that the Arab-Israeli dispute, was calling out for a solution so that the whole region could return to the obscurity it so richly deserved. And I think that's the way a lot of people feel right now about this. But I think it's very important to remember a couple of basic things. One, despite our growing energy self-sufficiency because of hydraulic fracturing and access to tight oil and gas, we are not truly energy independent because oil is a globally traded commodity. And we are still, as an economy, very sensitive to price increases. If something catastrophically went wrong in the region and Saudi oil went offline, it would have a big impact on our economy. Secondly, our allies, to the degree we still care about them, still are heavily dependent on hydrocarbon resources from this part of the world. So the idea that we don't have to pay attention anymore, have no more interest, I think is wrong and not the right way to think about the region from a strategic or a policy point of view. Second is that if you look at the national defense strategy, it makes pretty explicit that as we reorient ourselves to great power competition with Russia and China, which I firmly believe we need to do, that this is a region that we're going to be able to take risk in, in the parlance of the Pentagon that Colin and I are so familiar with. But the reality is, I think it's a bit of a, kind of conjurer's trick to think that we're, going to get a lot out of taking risk in the region, because there's not that much manpower to be saved out of this region right now. Maybe a couple of years ago, you could argue that case, but not right now for potential, fights with, Russia and China. Secondly, you're one event away, in that region from being forced back in a big way, whether it's an attack on the homeland that originates in the region, or whether it's a provocation and an escalation by Iran. You'll be back in the region in a big way, and you need to think about it, I think, in those terms. And finally, just from a global order point of view, this is a region that has always required, since Napoleon marched in the late 18th century and started the Ottoman Empire in its long retrocession, this is a region that's always required an outside power to balance it. And for better or for worse, since the British withdrew from their defense obligations east of Suez in 1967, that outside power has been us. And if we're going to continue to play that role, we're going to have to get over, these concerns that we have about, dealing with these interminable conflicts. We're going to have to figure out a way to do it. Otherwise, as Toria was saying earlier, we're going to cede the region to Russia, and they'll become the outside balancer and arbiter, and you already see it happening.
Or a Russia-Iran combo.
Condominium.
Yes.
I mean, just building on all of this, I like the leverage to nowhere very much, as well as the risk factors. I think, particularly with this sustained or increased military investment in Iraq and Syria, the administration did the right thing in trying to go after ISIS, but never was able to make the conversion to political leverage in the situations to create more stability and peace. And now, whenever you threaten to pull out of Syria, it just causes others who would like to organize it for Assad or for Iran or for Moscow to try to wait us out and wait for that moment when they can self-finance, whether it's through criminality, drugs, getting the oil fields, et cetera.
And it encourages everybody to hedge.
Exactly, and it becomes, and right now, to your point, Eric, I mean, we've got 6 major militaries and countless irregulars facing off over this tiny piece of territory called Syria, and it's a very dry piece of tinder, and at any moment we could get drawn in bigger. The fact that we went into Libya and then didn't stay for a political settlement, which you and I would have had a different outcome, I think, has made it a new playground for not only extremists, but for this regional and great power tug of war. And so we've actually accelerated the competition regionally and among larger powers. And I think the fact that we are not having a good conversation with Turkey about Kurds inside Turkey, but Kurds more broadly, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, also seeds that opportunity to create positive affiliation, but within borders. So, it's the frustrating thing is it's a moment of great plasticity, and it's a moment where we still have a lot of assets engaged, but we're not thinking about it regionally, and we're particularly not thinking about it in the Iran case. We have a declared Iran policy that it wasn't enough to stop the nuclear deal. You had to stop the missiles, but most importantly, you had to stop the territorial acquisition. And the longer we go without having a larger plan with friends and allies, just starting with the core countries that we have treaty obligations to, start with Israel, Jordan, Turkey. Europe, yeah, that's a good one, but, our Gulf friends, and figure out what Middle East we would like to see in 2030 or 2035 that is stable, that is pluralistic, that is led by its people, that provides more opportunity. We're just off the field, and we're not going to like the autocratic 1914, if not earlier, face-off among big and regional powers that results if we don't start playing
that very optimistic note.
Sorry.
We always come to the Middle East panel for optimism. What I'm going to do now is open it up for questions. Please wait until a microphone gets to you. Please identify yourself and ask your question in the form of a question. We'll go right here in the middle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One. My question on Syria for the panel is, walk us to the end of this conflict. How do we get that conflict to the Geneva peace table that is the stated goal for the U.S. and the military? And does it require presidential leadership or diplomatic figurehead like a Richard Holbrooke type? Absent of that, which we don't seem to have, who should be leading? Who is leading that process?
I'll take that first. Yes, yes, and yes. Obviously we need presidential leadership. We would need to have get back to an American vision of an end state that is chosen by the Syrian people, that is tolerant, that is a good neighbor, all of those things. We are sitting on a big piece of real estate in Syria. Our Turkish allies, who we haven't worked with on a Syrian end state in a long time, are sitting on a big piece of real estate. The Israelis care about another big piece of real estate. If we took those territorial assets and got together as democracies and said we're going to use these as leverage to work with Russia and force Assad back into not the Geneva process as originally conceived, but a conversation about a transition, about elections, about a stabilization force that may have to be there for a long time, not necessarily driving Russia off of its bases, but creating a more stable situation for everybody, and squeezing out Iran. It will take a negotiator, but it'll certainly take the U.S. stopping its conversation about leaving before Syria stops bleeding and hemorrhaging toxic fumes to other parts of the Middle East.
And the only thing I would take issue with regard to the question is characterizing Richard Holbrooke as a diplomatic figurehead. Any of those of us who worked with him would say there was nothing about being a figurehead that was...
Exactly.
Sorry,
Barbara.
Yeah,
I jumped on her.
I was just going to say, watch southwestern Syria because the regime is moving and is already breaching, in a sense, Russia is breaching the understanding that it arrived with President Trump a year ago in Da Nang. That will be the end, largely, of the conflict. This may all move to an end of the generalized conflict sooner than anybody can mobilize. Now, to Toria's point, that does leave some interesting propositions on the table. I'm quite skeptical right now that we can come to any sort of understanding with Moscow. I think Moscow and Tehran see great value in working in a general alignment with Assad. Assad does have a vote, not the preeminent vote, but he and the Iranians are tied together in terms of his future. Moscow makes a lot of noises about not being wedded to Assad, but I think that's sort of a bumper sticker. We have 30% of the population, 30% of the territory, the most resource-rich territory in the country. With Turkey, we have 40% of the territory. We have to knit up the problems with Turkey. I think it's a holding game, but I think it requires the administration to make some hard choices, and one of them is not to precipitously move anything.
So I know one thing, Kevin, this is actually a perfect example. Look, I think one thing we all agree on here is that however we got here, Syria is potentially explosive from an interstate perspective, which whatever one thinks of the civil war, this would be worse for the world. It might not be worse, it may be better or worse for the Syrian people, it'll be worse for the world. And one of the challenges, I think, is that the Trump administration had 4 big pieces of leverage that they've all given away for nothing. We were supporting the opposition. We ended that for nothing in return. We own a third of the country to include oil and gas resources. Assad and the Russians and Iran cannot reunify the country without our consent, and yet we're signaling that we're going to leave in exchange for nothing. We The country can't be rebuilt without the international community coming to the table. That means the Europeans, it means the Asians, it means the rich Gulf countries, and only the United States can rally the world to provide that money. And yet the president is signaling he has zero interest in stabilization and reconstruction, which means that's a source of leverage we could be dangling to Assad and the Russians and Tehran, who are otherwise stuck with the bill, that we have given away for nothing. And the last piece of leverage is our diplomatic heft to be able to manage the interstate rivalries between Israel and Iran and Russia and Turkey and us and Turkey and us and Iran. That requires us to be present. And whether it's Holbrooke or the president himself, it requires somebody, anybody, to care and to try to exert the type of influence that we had before. And whatever else one thinks of Barack Obama, he did not retreat from the Middle East diplomatically. Right? We were active on every front. You can claim we were effective or not effective. We weren't doing enough here or doing enough there, but we were in it. And they just don't, the current president doesn't care about inserting ourselves to resolve conflicts in the Middle East. It's not what he's here to do.
So I'll just add one point on all this, which is some of those ideas, especially that Colin mentioned, were in a report we did last year with our colleague Nick Harris for CNAS on how to end the Syria conflict. And if you come back next year, Nick is working on a big project, and he'll paint you a presentation at our 2019 conference on how to end this conflict. I think we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. Over here.
Kim Dozier with the Daily Beast. So the White House's thinking, as I understand it, on the Middle East peace process, on the Israeli-Palestinian process, is that by siding with Israel, they have made it clear to Mahmoud Abbas that the longer he waits, the less he's going to get. Do you think that has a chance of getting anywhere?
I'm very skeptical. I think, the fact, look, we have a situation where the relationship with Israel at the head of state level is excellent. We have great leverage to bring to bear there. We have no relationship with the Palestinians at this point for all the reasons that we know. I'm a big believer in the notion that each administration gets one shot to present its effort, its plan. I don't know how you present a plan where you don't have any connectivity with that other party, and I'm skeptical of the notion, and I think we've already heard this from around the region, that you can get other major Arab states to sign on to this overtly, whether it's political rapprochement or backing the plan diplomatically when you don't have that other party at the table. And whatever nascent convergence of views there are between certain of our Gulf country, partners and Israel, I think this is the delimiting factor here.
Can I say one thing on this? Look, I think to the degree that I understand the strategy out of the gate, it was to exploit this kind of grand alliance that had emerged between Israel and the Gulf states and Egypt and Jordan, of which Iran was an important but not the only aspect. The Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and kind of the anti-Islamist bent in general was important to that. To exploit that grand alliance to essentially impose a victor's peace on the Palestinians. That is a rump Palestinian state where the final status arrangements were not tilted completely in Israel's direction, but disproportionately in Israel's direction. And then Netanyahu would stomach the rest because he had the unqualified support from the President of the United States. That's my view. It undoubtedly carries a bunch of biases with it. And I think at some point, Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman were on board. If you at least believe the reporting, I don't know about MBZ, but certainly Kushner had worked MBS hard to, in essence, pile on to whatever the parameters were going to be to push the Palestinians to accept it no matter what in exchange for a lot of money or to be cut off completely if they rejected it. But two things queered the deal. One is the Jerusalem announcement, which made it politically unviable for the Gulf states or Egypt or Jordan to back the play publicly, even if privately they actually don't care very much about the Palestinians. I think it's, at least as a result, as it relates to the Saudis and the Emiratis, I'm skeptical they actually care very much about this at all. They'd love to have an arrangement with the Israelis that allowed them to bring their cooperation out of the closet. But they can't do that in a world in which you have violence in Gaza and the Jerusalem decision and these other things, which makes it politically unviable. The other thing that messes up the deal is the politics in both Israel and in the Palestinian territories, which remain in a position where neither side can make a deal. And given the corruption charges and the other things that Bibi Netanyahu is dealing with, he's got less room on his right flank to make any concessions to anybody, even Donald Trump. And of course, Mahmoud Abbas has been painted into a corner where he won't even meet with Greenblatt or Kushner or anywhere else. So, in the Middle East, it's not whether it's glass half full or glass half empty, it's whether it's glass half empty or all the way empty. And in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, it's pretty much all the way empty.
Just to win one small point, because this is an issue near and dear to my heart, which is just to say that on top of that, we have a real emergency going on right now between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza. And this possibility of a plan is taking out all of the oxygen in the room so that people are not focusing on that very urgent problem where the United States could play a constructive role in trying to address the situation.
But Elon is, with some work that you are doing
Yes.
for CNAS on Gaza.
Yeah, we do have an American task force that will be putting out a long report on Gaza in the fall with a number of the former ambassadors and others who have been working on this issue as Americans. Really probably the most serious look at this question of Gaza I think that anybody has done since 2005, at least from an American perspective. So hopefully we can come up with some constructive answers. With that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our panel for that was a great discussion.